Okay, folks, let me make sure that we've got closed captioning. There we go. It's getting late for me doing this. So I'm going to wrap it up. This one's a little bit of a longer review. Got one short one from today's class, especially if you were in period 2 and you were the grade level assembly. You missed what we did in class today, so I want to make sure that we get that. And then I am going to bed and putting these up online for you to watch and marvel at. So let me share our screen here, and away we go. This part 2 of what I'd like for us to review is going to be the relationships between economic systems and political systems and the updated post-Cold War categorizations of countries. This is where things got a little sticky, I think, in class. I wanted to clarify your understanding between the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and Freedom House. Now, folks, depending on which class you're in, some of this came up, some of it didn't. It's really important. I'm going to be emphasizing this in class as well. Stick with it. Watch this video because you do need to know at least what the UN and the World Bank, or the UN and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, are. Watch this video and it will once again be the more you know, as opposed to, oh, huh, what? Like the three little cats here. So also differentiate between what those organizations do, what the text says that we've been reading, and last, what I prefer that you think about the rest of this year when it comes to these categories. Hold tight, folks. Here we go. So, the United Nations. What does the UN do? The UN maintains international peace and security, develops friendly relations among nations, seeks to achieve international cooperation, and supports the strengthening of human rights. You need to know at least 2 things that the UN does, folks. You've got a list of 4 right there. Peace and security, friendly relations, international cooperation, supporting human rights. Somehow I got the slide clicking out of order. There's the question that we're looking at these next slides. What are the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank? Sorry, folks. Okay, the IMF. The IMF is the major financial agency of the United Nations, so it's actually part of the UN. It lends money to member countries, so members of the UN can get money from the IMF. The goal of lending that money, international global cooperation economically, ensuring stability financially for the world, maintaining economic growth for countries around the world, and a stated goal of also ending or slowing down the growth of poverty around the world. Right now, this is on the IMF's website, the most significant debtors, the countries that owe the most right now to the IMF, are Argentina, Egypt, and Ukraine. We might be able to talk about Argentina with this, folks, later on. It's really interesting because this is not the first time Argentina has owed money to the IMF, and it looks like they might bail on paying it back. We'll talk about that another time economically. Moving on. The World Bank. The World Bank is similar to the IMF, okay, but it is not part of the UN, not connected with the UN at all. Instead, it is organized by member governments. They rub my hands together like the member governments who lend each other money. Headquartered in Washington, D.C., but not associated with only the US government. There are over 100 countries that are part of the World Bank. The World Bank lends money to governments of economically struggling members of the World Bank. Again, reduce poverty, raise countries' economic standard of living. That means how how the quality of people's lives financially, and also according to some other measures like education and healthcare, which we'll talk about later on, and trade and global exchange, just like with the IMF. So there you go. UN, IMF, World Bank. So how are countries currently classified? We're not using the three world model. First, we've got economic measures, depending on the international organization involved. I'm going to run you very quickly through the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF's approaches to this. You're going to see some overlap, folks. UN uses three categories. One, developed economies. There's a subcategory of more developed industrialized economies, MDICs. We'll go into this a little bit more. Right now, what's most important is developed economies. We'll also talk about the G20 economies and countries later on. Don't worry about it right now. Just know that category one, developed. Two, economies in transition, where there's a whole range of economic levels. Third, developing economies, which the UN also has a subcategory of less or least developed countries, or LDCs. This actually comes up in your text as well. Side note, folks, this is important that the UN does do this because it helps the UN better prioritize which countries get money from the IMF. The International Monetary Fund has three categories: advanced economies, like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy. These are all countries in the G7. Used to be the G8. Russia was removed. Emerging market and middle income economies. The International Monetary Fund with that includes countries like China, Mexico, Iran, and Nigeria, as well as Russia. The other five countries that we'll look at in the big six this year are either in this range of emerging market and middle income countries. Also have Brazil, the Philippines, Chile, and Hungary. Lastly, low income developing countries. And those are countries like Myanmar, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Niger. You may not know, but I can let you know that these four that I've listed and others that are low-income developing countries are all countries that have experienced either significant regime change, so a shift from a democracy to an authoritarian dictatorship, or significant governmental change, like a coup d'etat, or civil war. Right now, Myanmar has instituted a military dictatorship. There's a civil war that split North and South Sudan. Afghanistan has been described as a failed state and now has a new government that's not necessarily recognized by all the countries in the world. And Niger is currently undergoing a civil war revolution. Not clear. It's not good. Countries that are in low-income developing country category by the IMF tend to have that in common with one another. World Bank has, again, three categories that depend on something called GNI per capita. Take a breath. Don't need to know this for any upcoming assessment, like Friday, but we will talk about what the GNI is. This is the gross national income. Gross meaning total. National, that means that it's both export and imports. And the income, the money that comes from that. Per capita means per person. Check out the link that I put up in the Google slide deck, and you can see how the World Bank categorizes these and has some shiny charts and graphs. We'll talk about something specifically in class a lot called GDP, gross domestic product, but GNI is something the World Bank uses that's different. I know, nerdy side note, But hey, folks, if it wasn't a review slide for me in a class for me, like where would the nerd be? It wouldn't be for me if there wasn't nerd. Um, World Bank, we have high income countries. High income countries, you might notice again some patterns. The UK, Norway, the United States, Germany, Japan, Israel, Croatia, Panama. Side note, Panama just moved up into this category recently. Middle income countries, World Bank actually splits up middle income countries with a range of upper middle income and low middle income designations. Upper, and here's where things get really interesting. We'll talk about how this feeds into GNI per capita. Again, the income per person. Go to the link here and actually see the levels. China, upper middle. Mexico, upper middle. Iran, lower middle. Nigeria, lower middle. Russia, upper middle. Turkey, upper middle. Ukraine, low middle. We'll look at shiny charts graphs and some quantitative data. I'm getting tired, folks, after doing several of these. Quantitative data that shows how the World Bank is getting upper and low middle income. Lastly, the World Bank uses low income, less developed economies as the third category. This has the subcategory of least developed countries, very similarly to the IMF and the United Nations. Now, all of that said, oh, actually, I just forgot, sorry. With the low income, less developed countries, World Bank has countries like Syria, Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen. Once again, folks, Yemen experiencing a civil war that has been intervened in by Saudi Arabia. Afghanistan, talked about that already. Sudan, civil war. Syria, civil war, and massive displacement of its own citizens. These are where the World Bank has grouped countries together that are considered low income and less developed. So I bring up the conflicts, folks, so that we can start to think about how conflict, revolution, coup d'etat, governmental collapse might impact economies, and possibly in advance think about, well, what makes a successful revolution, or can we even have successful revolutions or coup d'etats or governmental changes that are sweeping and big ones? Okay, we're almost there, folks. Second area, other than economics, democratic norms. And folks, you need to know these aspects of democracy. We talked about this at the very beginning of the year. So you need to be able to identify at least 3 or 4 specific democratic norms. We've talked about Freedom House. We'll look at those shiny charts later. There's a link if you want to take a peek now. Democracy Index, that's the article that we looked at the beginning of the year from the Economist Intelligence Unit. That is from the British publication, The Economist. They have a similar measurement to Freedom House. These democratic norms that they examine: free, fair, and open elections, protection of civil liberties and civil rights for all citizens, free and independent media, not controlled directly by a government, rule of law. You investigate what rule of law can be defined as and how it fits in with the concepts of justice, protection of individual and minority rights, and an independent judiciary. These are 6 different democratic norms, some of which we've talked about more than others, but they are all ways that Freedom House and Democracy Index use this second way to group countries together. All right, now the text that we're using takes economic and political description of countries, and then kind of smushes everything together. And I'm bringing this up, folks, only so that we don't get confused by the way the text is approaching things versus what you're reading versus what I'm walking you through now. I just want to make this very, very clear so that things aren't overwhelming. And you can check in with me in class to let me know if any of this review has done that. That the goal is that it's not. The text uses advanced democracies. I would say that a more accurate categorization would be, instead of advanced democracies, looking at democratic regimes, developed democracies, and developed economies like the UN. Communist and post-communist countries, that's how the text groups countries together. This is Russia and China. More accurate categorization that describes this would be countries that are non-democratic regimes. Again, we'll go into this a little bit more. Just want to introduce you to it now. Also, this is where the concept of economies in transition, communist and post-communist countries, Russia and China, those are those countries that are in transition. Less developed countries come up in the text that we'll be reading, LDCs, and also newly industrializing countries. What I think is a helpful comparative categorization for these would be developing countries. This is Mexico, Nigeria, and Iran. So for our class, please keep these comparative categorizations in mind. One, democratic regimes, so that's democratic political systems with with developed democracies and developed economies. Why is this categorization important? These are countries that have well-established democratic governments, strong evidence of democratic norms, and high levels of economic development, growth, and globalization connected with the rest of the world economically. Second, non-democratic communist and post-communist countries. This is how I would again suggest that we keep these categories in mind, regardless of what the text says. Communist, post-communist countries have been countries that have sought to limit individual freedoms and maintain legitimacy through heavy use of state power. That's the last piece of review information that we covered in class actually today, October the 10th. These are countries that have economic systems with varying levels of government involvement. We'll examine our class, Communist China since the 1990s. Side note, China describes itself as the people's democratic dictatorship with a socialist market economy, and more recently has described itself as having a socialist consultative democracy. If your brain kind of had a little moment, we'll unpack this in a couple of months when we look at China. The idea here, folks, is China has multiple ways of describing its approach to governing when it comes to power, authority, and force. For Russia, keep in mind that we'll run through what happens in Russia after 1991, the Soviet Union's collapse. And this is in the notes from class, but I wanted to clarify, when I talk about tracing the transition, it's going to be looking at what happens in the 1990s after the end of the USSR, and in terms of the political system and the political culture in Russia. And then what starts to take place after 2000, when President Vladimir Putin is elected for the first time. He's been elected 4 times since then, because it's really something that's going to be important for our class when it comes to political culture in Russia and the political system, kind of examining how Russia becomes increasingly authoritarian especially starting about 10 years ago after President Putin's 2012 election. Okay, again, developing countries, lastly, varying degrees of industrialization relative to their populations. And if you check this out, folks, there's a link. Here's the democracy index that I mentioned from The Economist. And if you click on the link in the slide deck, please do. You've got this gorgeous chart with the range of different types of regimes and governments, from authoritarian in the red or orange all the way to full democracy in the blue, and how they're laid out around the world. Interestingly, you might want to see what the US has in common with other countries, because it's different than Canada and definitely different than Sweden and Norway. Developing countries, again, medium to low standard of living compared to countries with developed economies. We've got a range, and we'll talk about this range, folks. I just want to introduce you to the terms liberal or full democracies, illiberal or flawed democracies. So talk about hybrid regimes. There you go, hybrid regimes. And lastly, non-democratic or authoritarian regimes. Now, again, I know this feels like so many different categories and words and terms. One, it's always important that you keep in mind and know exactly what the definitions and examples are for the bold-faced information that I put in the terms that are there online on Google Classroom. Second, remember, folks, I'm always going to introduce new stuff in this, not necessarily new in terms of our class, because many of these things came up verbally, but new because we're setting the ground for what we're going to talk about later on in the year. Okay, so if you're feeling like, whew, that was a lot, it's okay. You've got this. Hang tight. There's a lot to know, and you have an entire year to learn it. I'm going to stop the recording now. There we go. One last review video from today, the 10th of October.